Hello friends, I would like to continue a series of educational videos where I will be covering most typical beginner mistakes in chess. In each video, I will cover a real game that was played by a beginner versus an experienced player, in which typical and very common errors will be punished in an instructional way. In the following game, the player with the white pieces was rated 1200 on chess.com, and I myself was playing black. My opponent played e4, and in this game I decided to opt for an opening that's called the Perk defense. I played d6, which gives up the center. However, in the middle game I hope to attack the white center or try to get back central control and space advantage by pushing my own pawns. So my opponent grabs the center, d4, which is a very good move. I play knight f6. Now the reason for the pawn being on d6 is to make e5 harder. In this position, if white plays e5, I could just take the pawn, after which black gets a good endgame. White is losing the right to castle, as well as I can win the pawn back by creating these threats with my knight. So as you can see, Perk defense is different from another opening that is called Alekhine defense, where black is just playing knight f6 right away without the pawn being on d6. Now this allows white to push the pawn and win the space advantage without any consequences. The black's knight starts running, and of course this is also a way to play. Some grandmasters also like to play it from time to time, but that's a difference between the opening that I chose, which is the Perk defense. I have an extra grab on the square on e5. Here my opponent played the most popular move, which is knight to c3, and I opted for the main line with g6. That is the main move. I could also mention that it's possible for black to play e5, which leads to an endgame where white is just better. For example, d takes e5, which is the best move for white probably. I take back, and as you can see, the queens are exposed on the d file. White would be taking my queen, and king takes d8. One of the things that beginners don't know is that we castle not only to put the king to safety, but to connect the rooks and allow both of them to join the game. Think about it. As long as the white's king is on e1, it is very hard to get the h1 rook into the game. As soon as we castle, the rook will be able to get to e1 or d1, semi-open files, open files, a lot more easier. White in this position can also develop the initiative, hitting the pawn on c4, and although some grandmasters have played this with black, I didn't feel like this is a very good position to play against a weaker opponent, especially with such an early queen trade-off, and white is just objectively better. I played g6, and my opponent played knight f3, which is one of the main moves. The most testing option for beginners for white player here would be to play f4, which is so-called Austrian attack. I would like to take a look at this a little bit further because I feel like you can learn a couple of very important ideas. So the first thing to say is that white builds a very strong so-called mobile pawn center where white's pawns always can move forward. This pawn center, first of all, allows white to establish their pieces safely on the centralized squares behind them. I, as black, cannot kick his pieces out from there with my own pawns, and they're very effective squares for white's bishops and knights most of the time. At the same time, these pawns of his are really restricting area of mine. So my pieces, say on f6, the knight on c6, or the bishop on e6, similar squares to f3 and e3 and d3, are not so safe because white can always threaten to push these pawns, and I always have to watch out if I'm not blundering something or if I'm not allowing white to just win space advantage with them. However, in this concrete position, black is not scared of these three pawns currently, and so black can just play bishop to g7. Now, if white pushes the e-pawn, which is probably the first move that all of you will be thinking about, if that's the first time you see this position, then white might grab more than they can chew. Overextending and over-pushing the pawns with undeveloped army may create more weaknesses than you can cover. For example, after e5, black will be playing the move knight f to d7, and black is ready to bombard the white center with the move c5 and clean pawns up. For example, knight to f3 and boom, pawn to c5. Here black is already threatening to take on d4 and subsequently make e5 a huge target, which is going to be attacked by a pawn from d6, the knight on d7, and the bishop on the g7 square. So most masters, if they enter this position with white, they already start exchanging pawns. For example, pawn takes d6, and black sacrifices a pawn for the lead in development and initiative. White's king still remains in the center of the board, and the e file will soon be opened, after which black can use the rook and the queen to attack the white's king. For example, if white just grabs another pawn and black plays queen takes e7, and white plays a natural move bishop to e2, after something like cd4 and knight d4, we have the so-called open center without the pawns there, and black here just develops a deadly initiative. Black's pieces are like cybers, jumping everywhere and creating deadly threats. Now the knight is hit once, but I'm going to pin it, and it's going to be attacked the second time. The queen is also pinning the bishop on e2. There is so much tactical potential here for the black pieces that objectively white is lost. There are too many threats that black is threatening. So I didn't make the right or the best moves for white, but I gave you an example of how sometimes over pushing and overextending with the king in the center and undeveloped army can backfire. And that's what these openings where black is not fighting for the space, they're trying to do. They're trying to tease white into something like this, when the correct decision for white is just to play knight f3, solidify, and that's an absolute main move. After which white develops the pieces, consolidates, and at some point, of course, they're perhaps threatening something like d5, c5, or d5, e5, or f5. On the other hand, black also is always looking at moves like c5 and e5 in the middle game and trying to get space back at some point. In our game, however, white decided to go for knight f3 without this pawn on f4. Here, I played bishop to g7. White played bishop to d3. We have castles and bishop to e3. So white is developing the pieces seemingly to effective squares, and here I played a very provoking move, which is probably an inaccuracy objectively. I played the move knight g4, which moves the same piece twice, but I moved the knight here with a tempo. I'm hitting a bishop, which is more valuable piece than the knight, so I do create a threat. I open up my bishop along this diagonal, and my main idea is to just subsequently hit the center with something like c5 or e5 to get the so-called central control or space control back. At the same time, if I could clear up the pawns in the center, maybe if white's kings remain in the center, I could also decide to just open everything up. And the correct decision for white was to move the bishop somewhere. Well, even for example to a square like g5. I was planning something like h6. By the way, this was a not long time control game, just 10-minute game. So we didn't have much time to think, but still I feel like the inaccuracies by the opponent and the punishment are going to be very instructional. So here, for instance, bishop to h4, and I'm just striking back in the center with a move like c5. Now, very common error would be to play the move d5, as black now is winning the e5 square, and I will just establish a piece here. Well, for instance, I play knight to d7. My knight, say, is getting kicked out, and here I just establish an amazing knight on e5 square, and black has absolutely zero problems. So after the move c5, correct decision for white would be to take the pawn. I would take back, then kick my knight out. I would move it to the center, and I believe that after these exchanges, white is slightly better. This is not the only way to play by any means, but this is an example of what would be looking good or okay for white. However, my opponent after knight g4 didn't feel like this bishop is something he does not want to exchange for knight, so they just castled, and here I just grabbed the bishop. Now I'm happy to have exchanged one of the opponent's bishops, and I feel like the opponent paid the price by doubling their pawns. These pawns can never protect each other, and so they remain weak in the long term. If ever we get to an endgame, these are weaknesses as well. And here as black, I'm just striking back with the pawn move to c5. I'm hoping my opponent plays d5. Now, if they take on c5, they lose some central control, so I'm happy with that as well. I exchanged my pawn, which was on d6, for their pawn on d4, and here I would say black is absolutely fine. These remain weak pawns, and black has a very easy development with moves like knight to c6 and then the bishop somewhere. Now, in this position after c5, I have to say that black has a very easy development and white has these doubled weak pawns, and it's not clear how to consolidate the position for white or create counterplay. Black has no obvious weaknesses. And for this reason, I already evaluate this position as better for black. My opponent here played a move d5, which is a move I commonly see in beginner games as well. This is a big positional mistake. White has a light square bishop, and you want the pawns on opposite color of that bishop in order to give the bishop mobility. Look, the bishop is neither active on this diagonal, even if you go to c4, the bishop is passive here. And so the more pawns white puts on the light squares, the less active the bishop gets. This move d5 also has opened up my dark square bishop. Now I'm aiming at c3 and b2, and also, perhaps even most importantly, it weakens the square on e5 that I hope to use for one of my pieces. Here I played the move bishop g4. I want to win the e5 square, and I'm willing to exchange the bishop for a knight on f3 just to make my knight coming to e5 without any kind of challenge. So I'm also happy to exchange one minor piece because white's pawn on d5 grants white space advantage. So I have to make sure that I have effective squares for all of my minor pieces, bishops and knights, and perhaps I was lacking for such a square for my light square bishop if knight occupies the d7 square. However, of course, it's possible to play without a bishop to g4. Maybe I could just go knight d7, knight e5, and that light square bishop will find an active square somewhere. Here my opponent played a weird move, which is bishop c4. I played knight d7. I am trying to fulfill my idea of installing the knight on this beautiful outpost on e5 where white is not going to be able to kick it out with his pawns. After h3, I was already committed and willing to take the knight. Queen took on f3, and I finally established this knight on e5. Now I try to consolidate, and I want to expand on the queen side. I play a6. My idea is very simple. I'm hoping to make opponent's pieces passive or more passive and restrict them or kick them out with my pawns. Perhaps sometimes I could also have ideas of trapping this bishop somewhere with ideas like c4, and that's a small tactic that white has to be vigilant about. In the game, my opponent here played the move a4, which stops b5. I think the move makes sense. And here I played queen to b6. So I'm targeting this pawn on b2 right now and provoking them to push the pawn and make more weaknesses. And that's what my opponent played in the game. They played b3. So putting even more pawns on the light squares, now this bishop on c4 looks almost like a pawn, very passive. And at the same time, my bishop has been opened via this h8, a1 diagonal, and indirectly already might threaten all sort of discovered attacks. Those pieces of whites are indirectly hanging. So now I try to capitalize on new weaknesses that he has created. Queen e5 is a multi-purpose move. Maybe I would want b5 at some point in the game, but of course for now I'm just attacking the knight on c3. In the game, my opponent played knight d1 to run away, and here after knight takes c4, they realize that I attacked the rook on a1, white is losing material, and white has resigned. So I hope to continue this series. I will try to play all sort of opponents with ratings that fit the beginner level, from say 1000 to perhaps 1200s and 1400s, maybe 1500s, depend on what my subscribers are like. I will also to continue making videos for advanced chess players and teaching you various beautiful aspects of this game. If you did enjoy this video, please do subscribe to my chess channel. You can also consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. That's my full-time job for many years. My contacts are on the right. I wish you a wonderful day and stay safe, my friends.